Fear is not a sudden emotion. It is a slow, creeping infection that takes root when the unnatural violently breaches reality. At exactly 3 in the morning, the temperature inside the isolated manor drops to a freezing chill. A 7-foot-tall figure manifests on the glass-enclosed balcony. But it does not stand on its feet. It hangs completely upside down, suspended by an invisible force, its pale, lifeless face resting just inches from the cold floor. Its hair, impossibly long and matted with dried, black blood, drags heavily across the tiles. Its eyes are nothing but hollow, dark voids. This is not a hallucination. This is the lingering, violent curse of the Bahar estate. The origin of this localized nightmare traces back to a shattered promise and a forbidden, flesh-binding blood pact. Bahar, a once arrogant and wealthy man, returned from working overseas with a dark secret. He had abandoned his foreign bride, cutting all ties without a single word of warning, leaving her stranded. Instead of bringing her to his homeland as he had sworn, he hastily married a local woman. This new bride belonged to a family completely shunned by the community, a bloodline deeply entrenched in the most ancient, forbidden practices of black magic. The descent into pure, unadulterated madness was terrifyingly swift. Bahar grew uncontrollably violent. His eyes turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow, the blood vessels popping constantly. He stopped sleeping entirely, pacing the grand, empty halls of the manor at all hours, violently whispering to entities that lingered just out of human sight. He began making bizarre, blasphemous claims, declaring himself a prophet of dark, unseen gods. The atmosphere inside the house grew incredibly toxic, suffocating anyone who entered with a thick, invisible dread. Desperation drove his terrified family to summon a powerful, underground occult specialist. The dangerous ritual was prepared in the dead of night. The specialist carved a massive, deep geometric circle into the hard earth of the central courtyard, pouring crushed bone into the grooves. Bahar was dragged, thrashing, biting, and screaming wildly, into the center of the trap. The specialist commanded 4 unseen, ethereal forces to physically pin Bahar's limbs to the dirt. The air instantly grew heavy. The overwhelming stench of rotting flesh and sulfur filled the courtyard. The specialist struck Bahar's chest heavily with a wooden cane, demanding the possessing force to identify itself. Bahar's jaw unhinged unnaturally, tearing the skin at the corners of his mouth. A voice entirely devoid of humanity, deep, guttural, and vibrating with pure demonic malice, tore through his bleeding vocal cords. The entity revealed the horrifying truth. It had not come by choice. It was violently forced into Bahar's physical body through a dark curse. Bahar's new, occult-practicing wife had stolen his hair and fingernails while he slept. She had taken them to a desecrated, abandoned graveyard, offering the severed heads of 3 large bulls and 2 young goats in a horrific sacrificial blood pact. The demon was permanently bound to his soul through this visceral, bloody sacrifice. The specialist screamed, ordering the entity to release its grip and leave the human host immediately. The entity's physical response was immediate and terrifying. Bahar's body arched backward off the ground, his spine snapping into an impossible, agonizing curve. Thick, blackish blood began to aggressively and violently erupt from his nostrils, his gaping mouth, and his tear ducts. The dark fluid pooled rapidly on the dirt floor, sizzling as it hit the cursed circle. The demonic voice echoed from the blood itself, laughing maniacally. It stated that the dark pact was already complete. The demon had literally fused with Bahar's cellular structure. It was now swimming permanently in his veins. To exorcise the entity now would result in the instant, violent death or total, permanent paralysis of the host. Terrified by the sheer, insurmountable power of the blood magic, the specialist abandoned the ritual and fled into the night. Bahar was chained and locked away in a solitary, windowless room on the edge of the estate, left to rot in the dark with the demon inside him. But a demonic entity, fueled by a blood sacrifice, cannot be contained behind a simple wooden door. The family, financially draining and needing funds to maintain the crumbling estate, made a fatal, unforgivable error. They rented out the small room directly adjacent to Bahar's dark, cursed prison. The new tenant knew absolutely nothing of the blood pact, the sacrifices, or the screaming man next door. The tenant only knew that the rent was remarkably cheap. But the visceral horrors began on the very first night, signaling that the demon was no longer satisfied with just one soul. The tenant tried to sleep, but the heavy, oppressive silence of the estate was violently broken. Scratching, deep, rhythmic, and aggressive scratching echoed directly from the shared plaster wall. It sounded like thick, jagged fingernails tearing through the solid brick. Then, the temperature inside the tiny, claustrophobic room plummeted. A freezing, clammy pressure wrapped tightly around the tenant's left ankle. Invisible, decaying fingers pressed hard into the warm flesh, slowly dragging the victim an inch toward the edge of the mattress. The tenant reported the terrifying physical contact to the matriarch of the family the next morning. She dismissed the terror with a cold, calculated lie, blaming the rats and the drafty windows. She completely refused to reveal that a blood-bound demon was chained just inches away, rotting inside her own son on the other side of that very wall. The tenant returned to the cursed room. That was a fatal mistake. On the third night, at exactly 2 a.m, the haunting escalated into pure physical violence. The tenant was suddenly, aggressively yanked from the mattress. A massive, unseen force clamped around both of the victim's legs. With a sickening jolt, the tenant was hoisted entirely into the air, dangling completely upside down in the pitch-black room. The blood rushed violently to the head. Vision blurred. The victim thrashed in the darkness, kicking at the empty air, but the invisible grip felt like solid iron shackles. A guttural, demonic laugh, identical to the one from the failed exorcism, echoed loudly through the thin walls, vibrating directly inside the victim's skull. When the invisible force finally released its grip, slamming the skull against the hard floorboards, the tenant fled the estate in absolute terror, leaving all belongings behind. The matriarch's vicious lie was fully exposed. The possessed man was left completely alone, abandoned in the dark, a permanent, rotting vessel for the damned. Before continuing into the next documented nightmare, a serious question must be asked. Has an unseen hand ever grabbed you in the dead of night? If a paranormal entity, a vicious ghost, or a terrifying demonic force has ever breached your reality, leave a comment below. The dark forces are always listening, and the next documented encounter could be yours. The horror now shifts away from the rural estate into a densely populated urban environment. The year is 2022. A seemingly normal family relocated to the top floor of a modern, 5-story apartment complex. However, this specific building shared its concrete foundation with something incredibly ancient. A colossal, overgrown banyan tree grew directly against the side of the structure. Its massive, gnarled branches stretched out like decaying fingers, completely engulfing the rooftop in permanent, suffocating shadows. In many ancient cultures, banyan trees of this immense size are known to be highly active portals, massive magnets for ancient, wandering spirits looking for human hosts. A young girl residing in the top-floor apartment harbored a deep, consuming passion for acoustic music. Every night around 10, the girl would carry a heavy wooden guitar up the dark concrete stairs to the desolate rooftop, seeking absolute solitude. The chosen spot was a weathered bench situated directly beneath the sprawling, monstrous canopy of the ancient banyan tree. The isolation was initially comforting, but the rooftop was never truly empty. The ancient tree was always watching. One suffocatingly humid night, while aggressively strumming the heavy metal strings, the atmosphere completely shifted. A sudden, freezing gust of wind whipped violently across the concrete, carrying the putrid, unmistakable stench of stagnant water and decaying flesh. A dark, humanoid blur, unnaturally fast and completely silent, darted aggressively across the peripheral vision. The playing immediately stopped. Fingers clamped hard over the vibrating strings. Eyes stared wide into the suffocating darkness of the rooftop, desperately scanning the jagged shadows of the massive branches. Nothing moved. The silence was absolutely deafening. The creeping terror was rationalized away, desperately blamed on physical exhaustion and the flickering streetlights on the road far below. The playing resumed. But then, the undeniable, crushing weight of the supernatural pressed heavily against reality. The wooden bench violently creaked. The dense cushion compressed downward. The air immediately adjacent grew freezing cold. Someone or something had just sat down directly next to the musician. Every hair stood straight up. Breath hitched violently in the throat. The head turned slowly, terrifyingly, to look at the empty space on the bench. There was no physical body visible, but the heavy, oppressive feeling of a malicious, ancient presence staring directly into the soul was undeniable and absolute. Panic, raw and paralyzing, completely hijacked the nervous system. The heavy guitar was abandoned on the roof. Footsteps hammered down the dark concrete stairs, leading straight into the apartment, violently locking the heavy metal door against the outside world. Breathing was completely erratic. The heart hammered brutally against the ribcage. Cold sweat needed to be immediately washed from the face. Footsteps stumbled blindly toward the bathroom, completely unaware that the dark entity from the ancient banyan tree had not stayed on the roof. It had already followed its new obsession inside. The bathroom was completely silent. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, sealing the room. Cold water splashed violently against the pale face in the sink. The dripping echoed loudly against the porcelain. Slowly, the terrified eyes lifted to look into the glass mirror. There was no reflection of a young, frightened girl. Staring back through the glass was a towering, grotesque monstrosity. Its skin was the color of rotting ash, peeling away from jagged, unnaturally long cheekbones. But the eyes were too burning, completely blood-red orbs, glowing with an intense, possessive malice. The creature did not blink. It slowly raised a decaying hand inside the mirror, pointing directly at the glass. A silent scream tore through the vocal cords, but no sound escaped. The sheer, overwhelming terror instantly shut down the central nervous system. The body collapsed violently against the hard bathroom tiles, plunging into total, black unconsciousness. For 8 grueling hours, the victim lay completely paralyzed on the cold floor. When daylight finally broke, the horrific physical toll of the demonic encounter was revealed. The family forced the bathroom door open. The victim was found violently convulsing, eyes burning with an unnatural, terrifyingly deep shade of red. The body temperature had skyrocketed to a lethal, boiling fever. The hospital could offer no medical explanation. The vocal cords were completely paralyzed. The victim was entirely mute, trapped inside a silent prison of pure terror. The true horror escalated violently during the drive back to the apartment. Without warning, dark, coagulated blood forcefully erupted from the victim's mouth, violently splattering across the interior of the vehicle. Conventional medicine was entirely useless. A powerful, underground spiritual healer was immediately summoned to the apartment. The entity had to be confronted directly. The healer arranged a protective perimeter of burning candles on the living room floor, loudly chanting ancient, binding incantations. The victim's memory of the ritual was entirely erased by the sheer trauma. But the horrific truth was later revealed by the terrified family. The ritual had forced the ancient banyan tree entity to speak through the girl's vocal cords. It was a massive, incredibly powerful Jinn, a demonic being of smokeless fire. The demon confessed a sickening, terrifying truth. It had stalked the girl on the roof. It had become deeply, violently obsessed. She belongs entirely to the shadows now. The demonic voice had snarled, vibrating the glass windows. She will be dragged into the unseen realm. No human man will ever touch her, because her soul is already mine. The healer fought a grueling, spiritual war to sever the demonic tether. A heavy, iron-bound amulet was permanently tied around the victim's body. A strict, terrifying warning was issued. Never remove the iron. Flee the apartment immediately. If the amulet is ever taken off, the demon will instantly return to claim its bride. The family abandoned the complex the very next morning. The victim survived, but the suffocating feeling of being watched, of a dark presence lingering just out of sight, never truly vanished. The demon is still waiting for the iron to break. The final documented nightmare takes us into the suffocating darkness of a rural village. A mother lay severely ill inside an isolated hospital ward. Her teenage daughter, completely unaware of the ancient, predatory forces lurking in the dark, visited the hospital every single night. One particular evening, the strict cultural rules of protection were fatally ignored. The heavy, concealing garments were left behind. The hair was worn completely loose, cascading down the back. In the realm of the occult, unbound hair in the dead of night is a shining, irresistible beacon for wandering, malevolent spirits. The walk home required navigating a long, desolate dirt road that passed directly beneath a colossal, ancient tamarind tree, a notorious, heavily feared breeding ground for dark, unseen entities. The locals knew never to look up into the branches after sunset. The shadows beneath the tree were unnaturally dense, swallowing the weak moonlight entirely. While pausing to eat a sweet pastry beneath the massive, sprawling canopy, the atmosphere completely died. The insects stopped chirping. The stray dogs in the distance went completely silent. Then, a sudden, freezing gust of wind violently whipped through the heavy leaves, carrying the vile stench of rotting meat. It was not a natural breeze. It felt exactly like the cold, decaying breath of a towering figure, exhaling deliberately directly against the exposed skin on the back of the neck. A sharp, paralyzing chill shot straight down the spine. The supernatural contact was terrifying, but foolishly dismissed as paranoia. The girl quickened her pace, rushing back to her isolated home, completely oblivious to the towering, shadowy mass that silently detached itself from the tamarind tree and followed closely in her footsteps. The dark, horrific attachment was already complete. The safety of the home was a complete, terrifying illusion. The girl returned to the dimly lit house. Her father was seated in the distant living room, completely distracted by the faint, flickering glow of the television. Seeking rest, she retreated to the suffocating darkness of her bedroom. The only illumination was the harsh, artificial glare of her mobile phone screen, casting long, twisted shadows against the plaster walls. Silence blanketed the room. But then the air grew heavy, incredibly dense. A horrifying anomaly occurred right before her eyes. Directly between her face and the glowing screen, A decaying, impossibly long hand materialized out of thin air. Its fingers were unnaturally jointed, ending in thick, blackened, and jagged nails. It hovered completely still, blocking the light, radiating a freezing, graveyard chill directly onto her exposed face. A visceral, blood-curdling scream tore from her lungs. The father sprinted into the room, violently throwing the light switch. The hand instantly vanished, leaving behind the overpowering, nauseating stench of sulfur and dried blood. Desperate to calm the absolute hysteria, the father recited protective verses, forcing the terrified girl into a restless, nightmare-fueled sleep. But the morning light revealed a terrifying, undeniable truth. It was not a hallucination. The dark entity was violently angry. Deep, aggressive claw marks scarred the entire house. The solid concrete walls were deeply gouged. The thick metal door of the refrigerator was violently shredded, as if a massive, feral beast with iron claws had systematically destroyed the kitchen in a fit of demonic rage. The supernatural siege was escalating at a terrifying pace. The very next afternoon, the horror manifested in broad daylight. Returning from school, the girl sat down to eat. She glanced toward the open balcony doors. Standing on the sunlit veranda was a towering, completely unnatural entity. It was a 7-foot-tall man, but it was defying the very laws of physical reality. It stood completely upside down. Its bare, bruised feet pointed straight toward the concrete ceiling, while its head rested just inches from the tiled floor. It wore a filthy, tattered white burial shroud, the fabric stained with dark, unrecognizable fluids. Its hair, thick, matted, and unnaturally long, spilled across the tiles like a puddle of black ink, moving slightly as if underwater. The neck was twisted at a grotesque, impossible angle, allowing its hollow, entirely black eyes to stare directly into the dining room. The entity did not move. It just hung there in the daylight, radiating an aura of pure, concentrated malice. Absolute panic took over. The food was abandoned. The girl bolted blindly to her father, completely traumatized by the impossible, horrific sight. But the daytime manifestation was merely a warning. The entity was preparing to claim its victim physically. That very night, under the cover of absolute darkness, the demon launched a direct, violent assault. As the girl lay completely paralyzed in her bed, a crushing, invisible weight pinned her to the mattress. The entity aggressively attempted to violate her, tearing at her clothes with unseen, freezing hands. The heavy, invisible mass pressed down on her chest, completely restricting her airflow. The putrid breath against her neck felt like the damp air of an open grave, a horrific, invasive nightmare from which she could not wake. She fought back with pure, animalistic terror, finally breaking the unnatural paralysis and fleeing the room. The following morning, completely broken and terrified, she fled to the hospital ward to confess the visceral horrors to her sick mother. The mother immediately recognized the terrifying signs. The unbound hair, the dark road, the ancient tamarind tree. The girl had attracted a Khabish, a vile, incredibly aggressive class of Jinn known for tormenting and violating isolated human targets. Desperate, emergency, spiritual countermeasures were deployed. The mother ordered the immediate, relentless recitation of sacred texts, commanding the girl to spiritually seal her body every single night before sleep. For 4 agonizing days, the holy words acted as an invisible shield. The scratching stopped. The freezing temperatures normalized. The crushing weight vanished. It seemed, briefly, that the horrific nightmare was finally over. But ancient demons do not simply leave. They wait in the shadows, building their dark strength, preparing for the final, devastating strike when the human prey drops its guard. The mother was finally discharged from the hospital. The family was reunited inside the house, believing they were entirely safe. They were catastrophically wrong. The house was completely quiet. It was late evening. The parents were relaxing in the distant living room, the muffled, electronic sounds of the television providing a tragic, false sense of security. The teenage girl sat casually on the cold, hard floor of her bedroom. She was eating a simple meal, her eyes lazily scrolling through the glowing screen of her mobile phone. The holy words had not been recited. The spiritual guard was completely dropped. Suddenly, an unnatural, freezing breeze swept directly across the floorboards. The temperature in the bedroom plummeted instantly. Every single hair on her arms stood straight up. The heavy, suffocating stench of rotting meat, wet earth, and sulfur violently flooded the enclosed room. Slowly, entirely against her own will, her eyes were drawn away from the glowing screen. She looked down toward the narrow, pitch-black gap beneath her heavy wooden bed frame. Something was moving in the absolute darkness. A pale, violently contorted face slowly slid out from the deep shadows. It was the dark entity. But it was no longer a towering figure in a burial shroud. It had horribly, unnaturally compressed its massive, 7-foot frame into the tiny, suffocating space beneath the bed. The sickening sound of snapping bones and tearing cartilage echoed faintly as it shifted its crushed, twisted limbs. Its unnatural, hollow black eyes locked directly onto hers. And then, its jagged, rotting lips stretched backward into a grotesque, impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of razor-sharp, blackened teeth. Slowly, a long, decaying hand reached out from the darkness. The thick, jagged fingernails scraped agonizingly against the hard floorboards. The entity deliberately flexed its rotting fingers, gesturing for her to come closer. It was silently inviting her to join it in the darkness under the bed. The sheer, paralyzing horror completely shattered her mind. The metal plate of food slipped from her trembling hands, crashing violently against the floor. The deafening clatter broke the supernatural trance. A blood-curdling scream tore from her lungs. She scrambled backward, frantically kicking away from the bed, and bolted wildly out of the bedroom. She did not stop in the living room. She tore open the front door and ran blindly into the freezing, pitch-black night outside the house. Her terrified father chased after her, finding her completely hysterical, hyperventilating in the damp grass. She violently refused to step foot back inside the concrete structure. The absolute terror of the grinning monstrosity beneath the bed had permanently scarred her psyche. She spent the entire, agonizing night shivering outdoors, staring in absolute dread at the dark windows of her own home. When the sun finally rose, the desperate father immediately brought a highly respected, local spiritual specialist to the property. The specialist examined the deep claw marks, listened to the horrific encounters, and delivered a chilling verdict. The entity was definitively a Khabish, a highly malevolent, parasitic demon that specifically preys on the vulnerable. The girl had unknowingly summoned it herself. Walking down a desolate dirt road, late at night, with her hair completely unbound and exposed, she had acted as a blinding, supernatural beacon for the ancient evil lurking inside the massive tamarind tree. The demon had violently attached itself to her spiritual aura, completely obsessed with dragging her into its dark, unseen dimension. To sever the horrific attachment, the specialist prepared a heavy, blessed iron locket. It was tightly secured around the girl's neck. A strict, unbreakable protocol was established. For exactly 41 consecutive days, a rigorous, exhausting sequence of ancient protective rituals had to be flawlessly executed. If she missed a single day, or if the iron locket was removed, the Khabish would instantly return from the shadows to claim her soul permanently. The rituals were completed. the dark manifestations finally ceased. The deep claw marks on the walls were plastered over, and the terrifying entity was banished. But the psychological scars of the supernatural remain entirely permanent. The terrifying reality is absolute. The dark, unseen forces of this world are always watching, waiting patiently in the suffocating darkness for a single, careless mistake.